When we had global conversations about health, mental health just wasn't talked about. It wasn't discussed in the context of funding. It was very difficult due to stigma or discrimination, but national partners also struggled to be heard. It felt like an area that was woefully underrepresented. Where it was represented, it was not represented by people with lived experience or people from many of the countries that were being discussed. So we wanted to change that.
A very warm welcome indeed to Sarah Kline, who is the co-founder and CEO of United for Global Mental Health. Sarah, lovely to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's good to be with you. So I'm just going to make a little introduction as to who you are, Sarah. Many people, of course, know, but some may not. So I'll just give you a bit introduction and then we'll head into that. So Sarah, you work for and are the co-founder and CEO of United for Global Mental Health. We often call that United, a UK-based global mental health charity that exists to advocate, campaign and fundraise for greater political and financial support for mental health around the world. Over the course of your career, you've developed and delivered successful national and international campaigns and initiatives aimed at governments, international institutions, and political parties at the highest levels. And we're going to nip into some of those in a minute. From 2011 to 2017, you worked at the World Health Organization in a variety of positions focused on polio eradication, public health emergencies, including the Ebola outbreak of 2014. And then prior to that, you worked for WHO, but prior to working for WHO, you founded Malaria, No More UK, an NGO dedicated to helping end malaria. You worked for the British government, for DFID and the FCO, and the World Bank, Oxfam GB, and a private lobbying company in Washington, DC. You're an experienced media spokesperson, appearing in numerous national and international broadcast and print outlets. So it's lovely to have you join us today on the Flourishing Minds podcast. We're delighted to have you be with us. Perhaps we could jump in with a little bit about your own background. You know what it is when people are doing sort of professional broadcasts and so on and so forth. There isn't really time to do that. But in this podcast, we do have the opportunity to go a bit wider and to get to know the person behind the job, behind the scene. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about where you studied at university and maybe tell us a bit about your involvement in Make Poverty History way back in 2005.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for inviting me. I feel very humbled to be asked. Yes, so my background, I was interested in politics and change and how you get change to happen from quite a young age. I used to run an amnesty group at school, which I'm not sure everybody else was as interested in as I was, in writing letters. But I worked out fairly early on that in order to make change happen, you needed to understand the political process and you needed to be able to persuade politicians to change policy and practice. So I focused on that in even at school, but certainly at university, and so how political change takes place. And after university, I went to the US because at the time in the UK, it was thought that we were adopting more and more US practices in terms of lobbying and advocacy and things like that. So I wanted to learn how that worked. So that's where I started out, which was quite a baptism of fire into the world of lobbying and politics.
I can imagine.
Yes. But I think it's helped because I think it helped me understand how politics works, what people are interested in, and how to persuade people to make change happen. So I started there and that's kind of built from there in my career.
Great. I was when I was researching this podcast, I noticed that you had worked for one of the prime ministers, and you actually were able to help him with his MDG call to action.
Yeah.
Just tell us a bit about that because it's rather intriguing.
Oh, okay. Yes. So after I worked for the World Bank for a number of years doing external relations. And then I went to Oxfam and did government relations for them in the UK, but then and also for the G7 processes or G8 processes. So got more and more involved in British politics and issues around what was happening in the UK, but also the UK's leadership in the world at that time in terms of driving the discussions around development, particularly the fulfillment of the Millennium Development Goals. And I went to work as an advisor to the Secretary of State for International Development. And after that, I was asked if I would basically run a campaign for the Prime Minister, who at that time was Gordon Brown. And the idea of the campaign was to try and increase support for the Millennium Development Goals and try and get them over the line. It was about halfway through the MDGs. It's 2008, 2007-8. There was a lot of concern that they were off track, that countries weren't paying enough attention to them. So we were building a campaign which involved enlisting governments around the world, using the Foreign Commonwealth Office's network, engaging governments, engaging civil society. We did a big rally with faith groups and worked with everyone from the Vatican to so it was and we did quite a lot with the private sector. So the idea was to demonstrate the broadest possible societal support for the Millennium Development Goals, and it culminated in an event at the UN in 2008, which was hosted by the UN Secretary General, and delivered around $16 billion worth of pledges for different issues.
So that was you talked about a baptism of fire earlier in your life, your career, but that must have been another kind of baptism as well, at a different level.
I think at each stage, I've always tried to take on something that seems not necessarily impossible, but a big challenge, because I think that's more interesting. I led the political strategy for Make Poverty History, which was a big campaign in the UK in 2005, but also had global ramifications because the UK was hosting the G8 at that time. So, yeah, I think taking on big challenges, trying to really drive change, drive conversation, push people's ambition has always been something I've been interested in. Yes.
And your career has moved between national and international politics, or policy making around politics. Then through to more specialized areas. For example, you were for a while with the WHO working on polio, but then the Ebola crisis.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that, the Ebola crisis in particular, because even though it was some time ago now, it still feels quite a scary thing to be working on.
Yes, it was a really interesting time. So I'd worked for Bruce Aylward on polio and raising funds for polio. When we'd done a big vaccine conference and raised about 4.5 billion at that time for polio. And then I'd gone and done some other work for WHO, including in the Philippines, and post Typhoon Haiyan, the recovery and how do you build back after a natural disaster. So I went back to work for Bruce on Ebola, and it was all consuming. So at that time, it was a very scary disease. There was no known treatment or cure. Certainly not cure. The prevention was challenging. There wasn't a vaccine. It was spreading quite fast. It was affecting very poor communities who often were quite wary of strangers, external people coming in, taking away their loved ones for treatment, and they never saw them again.
Yes, never coming back. Yeah,
never coming back. So it was a very moving thing to work on, because it was happening in real time, and it was affecting people's lives in a way that was, I think, previously unimaginable in many cases. So my role, though, was to raise the money and manage the money that was coming in, and it was about $500 million at that time for WHO.
Okay. So I think we ought to move on. Much as it's interesting to talk about your career in general, because it's covered so many of the important health and development elements of history over the last few years. But I think we ought to go and talk a little bit now about UGMH, United, and its campaigns. Perhaps you'd like to just start by outlining what the organization does, and perhaps maybe first of all, just how did you get involved? Because I know you're a co-founder as well as CEO.
Yes, no, a woman called Alicia London, who'd been working with the princes, and well, at that time it was the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, Prince Harry. She'd been working with them on their mental health campaign, which had been successful, and she could see there was a global gap in mental health campaigning, and so wanted to take that forward and came and talked to me and another friend, mutual friend. And the three of us really got together to help kind of develop out the context and the construct of what the campaign would look like, what the organization would look like. And then about 2-3 years into that, Alicia left and I took over as CEO. And I think the organization was founded because there was an obvious gap, which was that when we had global conversations about health, mental health just wasn't talked about. There wasn't the same prominence given by the international community. It wasn't discussed in the context of funding. It was very difficult due to stigma or discrimination, but national partners also struggled to be heard. And on the international stage, very often national partners weren't there. It was a relatively small subset of the community who was often doing the talking, maybe European or American researchers talking about the people they were researching elsewhere, but those people weren't there. So it felt like an area that was woefully underrepresented. And also where it was represented, it was not represented by people with lived experience or people from many of the countries that were being discussed. So we wanted to change that.
And so that's how it all began.
Yes.
Talking about the question of underrepresentation, I can remember your current chair, in fact, Professor Sir Graham Thornycroft, actually leading a campaign for mental health to be included in the SDGs, that is to say, the group that came after the MDGs. And that was a very important campaign, wasn't it?
Yes, he did amazing work. I think the very fact that he had to campaign so hard to get the basics around mental health into the Sustainable Development Goals, having not seen it at all as part of the Millennium Development Goals, just shows how far behind mental health was in terms of representation and support. And so, yes, it was a critical moment to get things like the suicide rate now properly part of a development index, if you like. And for us, it's been about how do you get more political and financial support into mental health? How do you get policy reform such that there's a better and higher quality support for people with a mental health condition or at risk of a mental health condition?
Yes, absolutely. Maybe you would like to just describe one or two of the campaigns that United is involved in at the moment.
Yes, of course. So the way in which we figure out what we're going to be doing is by talking really to national partners about where are the areas where they are campaigning or advocating for, where they feel like it would be helpful to have international support or where they want to kind of work with others in other countries. So one area is around the decriminalization of suicide. Suicide is a crime in civil law in about 25 countries. And what we've been doing, and we've just actually launched our second report on this, is working with Trust Law, which is part of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and really delving into what is the legal framework that's criminalizing suicide in at least 23 of these countries, and how could you overturn it? What would it take to decriminalize suicide? And we've worked over the past few years with national campaigners who have successfully decriminalized suicide. It succeeded in achieving that in countries such as Pakistan. And our job really is to support national partners in whatever way they feel is most important. But some of it is the legal knowledge about what is the law and how to change it. So.
Right. And you talk a lot about, not only now in this discussion, but also on your website, etc., you talk a lot about national partners. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind just explaining what you mean by that, and
yes,
maybe
absolutely.
give an example of one or two.
Sure. So in the case of Pakistan, for example, we've worked quite a lot with Taskeen. So they set up as an organization to do and what we do, but at a national level, around better political and financial support for mental health, better policies. They also have quite a strong public information arm to what they're doing. So explain to the public about different concepts around mental health, raising awareness, encouraging people to seek support, helping them find that support. And the partners that I refer to are primarily those kinds of organizations. They are either leading or they are running a coalition of mental health organizations, or they are a leading mental health organization in their own country. They are driving the conversation around change. But it may be a coalition of many organizations. But what we're interested in is particularly organizations with a strong emphasis on lived experience, and on really understanding what communities feel is the best way to address mental health. Because, of course, in many countries, the default has been institutional care, a medical approach, which is very valid in some cases, but there's a lot more to mental health than that. So it's trying to broaden out the conversation and bring in more voices and a more diverse set of voices.
Okay, that's great. I know that you're also involved, or have been, with the Mental Health HIV/TB Global Fund.
Yes.
That's a little bit different, isn't it, to what you described?
Sure. So the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB and Malaria is the largest health fund in the world. It has a budget of about 16 billion over 3 years. What we wanted to do was try and persuade the fund to integrate mental health into its programming so that people at risk or living with HIV or TB could actually get mental health support. And that was for two reasons. The main one is that it's bi-directional. So people at risk or living with HIV are more likely to have mental health condition or develop them, and vice versa. If you live with a mental health condition, you're at higher risk of developing HIV or TB. So our job was to first persuade the fund to change its policy. And then secondly, it's now to work with partners, UN agencies, and also civil society and governments at country level, so that when there's an application from a country for money from the Global Fund, it fully includes mental health support. And we're seeing more of those applications. Mongolia is an example, where countries are now realizing the benefit of including mental health support in order to have better treatment outcomes and prevention outcomes.
Okay. As you've been talking about, persuasion, policy change, and so on and so forth, it throws up a really interesting picture but also a really interesting question of how does a person who has worked most of her life in this way, how do you actually set about it? How do you set about? I mean, can you see what I mean? Because if you're not involved and haven't done it before, I've been on the edges of some campaigns, of course, and in my own work with mental health, but I was mostly working operationally in the field. But I'm just wondering, because it feels so nebulous in one way, and yet some of the outcomes are so important,
Yeah.
So it's an interesting one, I think.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. One that I've been working on, helping to set up over the last year, which was interesting, is around how do you get mental health better included in climate change, for example. So how did I do that? I had to learn about the topic first. I didn't know a lot about climate change and mental health. So you have to go out and learn from the people who know about the links, the science, the research, the evidence, the people with lived experience accounts. So you need to know the issue first, and understand the nuances of the issue, and then figure out, well, what would change it for the better? So in this case, what we are working on is where the WHO is talking about climate change and health, or where the COP is talking about, Conference of Parties is talking about climate change and health, it includes mental health explicitly and with acknowledgement of the issues that are relevant. And then from that, if you have at an international level, that dialogue where mental health is automatically included, and you see it in IPCC reports, and you see them starting to keep reporting on that evidence, then you translate that into national level, and you work with national partners who are saying things like, if the government's developing a national adaptation plan, have they thought about air conditioning for mental health institutions? Have they thought about the fact suicide rates go up when there's a heat wave? Coming down into quite practical things about what will you do differently. So in the first instance, you need to learn about the topic and learn what the evidence is, what the science tells us, what the data tells us, who the leaders are or the influencers are there. What are the kind of global picture about how you can shift a conversation globally through certain meetings or discussions. Maybe the WHO resolution that was just done on climate and health, which we targeted. But then the key thing is, well, what will change things on the ground? So what is the national process by which you can influence? So yes, quite a lot of learning, quite a lot of humility, frankly, to learn and to recognize you don't know, but you can probably add value in a certain way.
Sounds fascinating. Except that no one smokes these days. I'm sort of thinking of smoke-filled rooms, you know.
You mean because it feels like it's, yeah, I think that's also part of it, is trying to get away from the idea that there are rooms that are exclusive or things are exclusive. So the work that we do on climate and mental health, actually, most of that is led by our partners in low middle income countries. We went out to them and asked, what are you doing? What do you want to share with others? And that's where the Global Mental Health Action Network comes about. So we set up the Global Mental Health Action Network precisely as a free network anyone could join to share information about what they were doing on mental health and how they were advocating for change, what changes they were trying to achieve. So we have peer-to-peer support, because it's quite lonely sometimes working on mental health. It's heavily stigmatized. And lots of people, whether they're in a UN agency or in a small NGO outside the capital city, have very few peers that they can talk to and will exchange ideas with or learn from. And so the network was created with that in mind, and it has a whole series of working groups where people are sharing information about how they make change happen. So I just joined a session today, which was around digital communications and advocacy, and it was talking about how you make change happen using Facebook and Twitter and all those things. And that was a colleague from Philippines sharing her experiences, our colleague who's based in Kenya, and then others from different parts of the world.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So we ought to just emphasize that, shouldn't we? It's the Global Mental Health Action Network.
That's right, the Global Mental Health Action Network. We now have about 5,600 members from 166 countries.
Brilliant.
And 2,000-3,000 organizations. It's moving and changing every day. It's increasing. But there's opportunities to join working groups, to join knowledge exchange sessions, which is like capacity building learning. We have webinars. There's lots of things that people can do. There's an online community which has over 1,000 members. Circle.
That's great. So, when we first started to prep for this conversation, I immediately joined.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. I hope that it's interesting.
Yes. No, it's fine. But anyway, you got another one then.
Thank you. That's good to know. The membership has exploded, particularly with COVID, because when COVID started, what I did was set out with the editor of the Lancet Psychiatry to try and get as much information out as quickly as possible about mental health and COVID. And that needed to be done online. So we were doing webinars every week about the kind of key topics, the key evidence, what was happening in different countries around the world. And from that, we built out more of the webinar series, which is not every week anymore, but it's that idea of democratizing access to knowledge and also hearing from people on different continents, not people just from one area.
Let's take a step back and just sort of think about the real achievements of United over the last few years, which have been very exciting since the early days with you and Alicia and so on, and coming right up to date. What do you think? Just speaking personally for a minute, what do you feel best about? What do you feel good about?
A few things. I mean, I think we've touched on some of the policy changes that are easy to communicate around helping decriminalize suicide in certain countries, seeing the Global Fund change its policy and start to make a difference for accessing funding. I think another thing that I feel good about is that we changed, particularly since I've been CEO, we've changed our hiring models so that we are a virtual network of staff members around the world. And we very deliberately hired from national partners and those colleagues now run global campaigns and run global influencing and advocacy. And I think doing that in concurrence with the work that we've done in the Action Network has started to change who is listened to in mental health and at a global level, and what representation really means in a more meaningful way. So I'm very proud of the fact that, for example, my colleague Hamdi from Somaliland recently did a blog for the NCD Alliance and will be speaking at the NCD Alliance conference. My colleague Ali has been speaking to the BBC World Service about suicide decriminalisation, and we are arranging for our colleague from Sierra Leone to do so this week. I really feel strongly that we won't have change if you don't listen to the people who are closest to where change needs to happen. And that means giving up your space to make that happen. And I think United has created space for people, but it's also given up space to others. And that's important.
Yes, I think that is important. As you know, I've been a social entrepreneur most of my life. And I always felt that approach to employment was really important. And the fact that you've gone very strongly in that direction, I think is great, really great. So, as you know, a lot of people these days are interested in going into mental health, particularly young people, and they're much more conscious of well-being and mental health. Do you have any advice or thoughts as to how they should, get involved, either informally, voluntarily, formally,
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a variety of ways. I think it's important from the beginning to check your own capacity or resilience. Talking about mental health is important, but you're opening yourself up to having conversations about mental health that may touch you in ways that you weren't expecting, that may make you feel responsible for things that you weren't expecting to feel responsible for. So I would be careful about kind of going straight into it. I think it's important if you live with a mental health condition like I do, or, everyone has their own levels of resilience. And that's quite important. I think the simplest things to do are obviously to volunteer and to learn how to be able to be supportive. What are the right things to say if someone is in distress, or if someone would like to talk about their challenges, where to signpost people for more information, and how to, be aware of not using language that's stigmatizing, etc. I think those are all things that are relatively simple. And part of the best way to destigmatize mental health is to talk about it.
Yes,
so I wouldn't be afraid to talk about it. I just think we need to be very careful not to put yourself into a therapeutic realm, because that takes training. And we do want more people to go into the mental health workforce. We need a lot more people in the mental health workforce. But that does take training, and that will take time to be able to do that responsibly. And then I think there's lots of opportunities to listen and learn. There's joining the Action Network is one way just to listen and learn more. And I don't think you can underestimate how different mental health is in different countries and cultures, and how people talk about the issues, what matters to them, what the issues are that are influencing their mental health. So the more you can listen and learn from those with lived experience, the better.
Thank you for that. Well, look, we're coming to the end of our session. It's flown by. I don't know whether you think it has. But for me, it's like, it's gone. It's, we started and we finished. So I just wanted to thank you very much, Sarah, for being with us. If people want to write and get more information about United and so on, what should they do?
They're very welcome to email. So there's info @unitedgmh.org. Obviously, our website, which is also unitedgmh.org, and the Action Network's website, which is gmhan.org. So you can Google it, but Global Mental Health Action Network.
Yeah.
Always pleased to hear from people. I think it's really important that people do feel confident to, join, to engage, to have conversations. That's how we will make change happen.
Well, it just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.